Thank you, Stephen Mirabai. That was such a lovely meditative song and brings us back to the idea of gratitude as the cure for what ails you. So we are now in our celebration of light. We are looking at both solstice, which we'll be celebrating tomorrow night, and Christmas, which we'll be celebrating later this week. Just so many wonderful things to celebrate at this time of year, and yet I am actually hearing a lot from people who are struggling with this season this year because it is so very different from anything those of us who are alive right now have ever experienced before. Now, it's not the only time this has ever happened in human history, but this is kind of an interesting, said with the appropriate eye roll, time to be alive. There is an old, I believe it's a Chinese curse that says, may you live in interesting times. I'm actually understanding now why some people would consider that a curse. I just think it's cool. So winter solstice, which is what we're talking about today for the most part, is something that is celebrated historically as the shortest day and longest night of the year. This is the turning point in the days getting shorter and shorter and shorter, and now they start to get longer and longer and longer again. But this is, if you want to think of darkness as bad, this is about as bad as it gets. And having said that, it's important to remember that this is a time where historically what was going on was that people were eating the last of the fresh food. And the time that would be called the starving times in some cultures was about to begin. So if last year wasn't good and you couldn't put enough food away, if you couldn't get all what we would call prayed up in your soul, there may or may not be enough sustenance to carry you through until we could plant more, until we could create more food, until the spring when stuff started happening again, and it wasn't all indoors and internal and quiet and dark. And so winter solstice was seen as a time of hope to remind us that this was as dark as it would get and that the light was returning, that there was a promise there, that there was a promise of survival, there was a promise of power and peace and the ability to see ourselves through to the next year, that the gods or goddesses would take care of us. There are those who are talking as if the darkest night was never going to end. And I would just invite you to use this philosophy to look that in the face and then take a step back and get some perspective. Reality checks are a wonderful thing. For instance, it is only winter solstice in the European and American and, well, mostly European traditions. If you go down to the southern hemisphere right now, it's their summer solstice. This is the longest day and the shortest night. This is when they go to the beach. This is the high point of summer for them. So if we're willing to step back out of our own personal story, there is more light, there is more good to celebrate. There is something that happens at Christmas that kind of we Christians, or Christians in general, usurped from that celebration in the northern hemisphere of the solstice night, where in spite of the darkness, we chose a time around solstice in which to celebrate the birth of the Christ. Now, in religious science terms, that means the celebration of the birth of the Christ in each of us. Doesn't do us any good if it happened 2,000 years ago and never since. We are to birth the Christ through us. And so rather than looking at all the darkness, it's kind of like the early Christians said, look, a Christ child, instead of look, a chicken. It's a way of distracting us from the darkness and refocusing us on a deeper truth. It's so easy to get lost in that immediate, more attention-grabbing and sometimes more painful truth, little t truth. Homes who is the founder of our philosophy, wrote that we should control the subjective and not let it control us. And by the subjective, he means all of those little unspoken thoughts, all of that, those subconscious beliefs that we have inherited from over time and cultures, all of those unspoken, things that we don't even know that we think or believe. We need to control it. And one of the things we do to make that happen is to step back and get some perspective, get what one of my ministers used to call a God's eye view of whatever the issue might be. And so I will remind you that as we take that deep breath, we see it through God's eyes. We remember that down in South America, they're celebrating summer solstice. And if you have the means or the courage to turn on the news and let them try and fool you, I'll just remind you that all of those commentators talking about the economy being horrible and oh my God, it's all falling apart. You know, you would almost believe that the Grinch did steal Christmas and that the book didn't end the way we were told, that the Grinch really just stole it and now it's all awful and the Who's down in Whoville don't get to sing anything at all. That's not what's going on here, guys. Yes, there is a difficult economy going on out there, and we do not shame or blame anyone who is suffering from it. We allow ourselves to be of service to them. We allow ourselves to lift them up through consciousness. And, you know, maybe we spend what we would have spent on parties helping out our neighbors. I will remind you that this is not the first recession, or even if it becomes a depression, it's not the first time it's ever happened, even in America, and that's only been going on for 200 years. During the Great Depression, some people believed that everything was awful and that there was no way to get ahead. Other people looked around at what was going on and identified a need and an opportunity. And that's how we ended up with Harley Davidson, and that's how we ended up with the Disney company, both of which began during the Great Depression. See, it's only really bad if you believe the hype about it. It is possible to step back and say, I'm going to create something good from this. I don't care what everybody else's opinion is. They can gloom and doom all they want. They can let the Grinch have their Christmas or their solstice or whatever party you're at tonight. I choose to remember that I am the Christ consciousness, to remember that the light lives in, through, and from me, rather than only from other people's opinions or other people's traditions. We get to make our own traditions. And that's part of what we're doing tomorrow night. So I really do hope that you will join us as we experiment with what can be. You know, it is so easy to fall for the hype. When in the early 90s, I finally got my master's degree in counseling, I went through a period of realizing that a shrink in Southern California was like coals at Newcastle or ice in Alaska. There were a lot of us. And the system, as I was told and believed, was rigged so that we wouldn't end up with even more. When I graduated, you needed to get a certain number of hours, which were all unpaid, and unfortunately I hadn't won the lottery yet. So 2 or 3 years of unpaid work was a challenge for me. And then what I was told and what I fell for was the idea that the system was rigged so that only about a third of people taking the written test would pass, and that then you had to take an oral panel, and there were panelists who had never passed anyone. And so there was this whole game going on, and a belief that I brought into myself saying, I am never going to be able to be a psychotherapist in Southern California. Which is fine, because as a result of having believed that, I moved on to the next thing, which spirit within me was calling me to use, yes, a psychological background, but also everything else that I am to become a minister. Now, people out there may have their opinions about how wonderful that is. I think it's awesome. I think it's the best Christmas gift I ever get, was that failure to become a psychotherapist in Southern California. It is okay to buy into a belief that turns out not to be true. It doesn't mean you're evil. It doesn't mean you're stupid. It means that in that moment, you are beautifully human and that you have the power to change that belief. It helps to have some people around you going, no, I'm not buying your story about how awful it is and how the Grinch won and how you're going to go, 5 steps down the road, you're going to be eating a worm and dying of starvation under a bridge or whatever it is your story always ends up in. There is light. There is always a higher truth to go back to. By the way, did you know that many of our greatest companies began while the economy was bad? Maybe you've heard of General Motors or General Electric or IBM. Here in Prescott, because we're kind of a small town, I remember when Trader Joe's showed up and it was like, civilization has arrived and now we have a Trader Joe's and 2 drive-through Starbucks. There's some belief systems. FedEx began during a recession. And for those of you who are younger and can't remember what IBM stands for, I want you to think about the companies of Microsoft, Facebook, and Google, all of which are so successful now that they might have to be broken up in order to comply with not being a monopoly. We absolutely still have the power to use this teaching. As a matter of fact, our founder said that this is the best time to use it. It's the most satisfying time because it becomes like magic, and we're going to talk about that next week. What we need to do is remember, as Ernest Holmes taught us in The Science of My Textbook, every man, and I would add woman, so every person stands in the shadow of a mighty mind, a pure intelligence, and a divine givingness. He also wrote, we abide under the shadow of everlasting truth. And so we welcome that shadow because you know what? That shadow means that we are within an everlasting truth, a light so bright that our very being creates the shadow, which reminds us that the light is there. One of the best tricks I ever learned was to start recognizing that the great teachers over time have all very beautifully tried to teach us that we are both light and shadow. We don't have to demonize either side. We don't have to make God far away. We don't have to make good something we're not allowed to admit we know about. We don't have to be the miserable sinners or think that there's something about our humanity that makes us inherently bad. We are both fully Christ and fully human at the same time, and that is what the master teacher Jesus came to teach all of us. He did it by example, as did every other great Christ or anointed being that has ever come into the world in any culture or any religion. The great thing about that is that we have that same ability to warm others by allowing our light to shine. One of the ways we do that is through prayer. And so I invite you to celebrate with me within your heart, doing what we call prayer, which is done a little bit differently than perhaps some mainstream religions have taught it. And so I ask you just to join me in consciousness. Know that while we are physically separate, this very broadcast is proof that we can all still connect, that we are truly one, that God, that thing we call God, by whatever name, is infinitely present right here, right now. It is still the greatest truth there is. God, that single power and presence, has taken on the form of this multiverse. There is only the divine mind, nowhere else to go and nothing else to be. And so in this moment, I remember, become aware that all of us are both divine and human, are both and rather than either or. And so the Christ within me stands witness to the Christ within all of us, knowing that the glory of God shines into, through, and out into the world through us as we choose to allow it to shine. I know and claim with everything in me that as we stand in that truth, anything that is unlike that truth simply fades back into the nothingness from which it came. The shadow serves only to remind us of the light. And as we claim and welcome each part of ourselves, there is less and less that we can call shadow or negative. And it's all light. I bless and celebrate that during this holiday, holy day season. I bless and celebrate the light that is eternal, as in, through, and for each and every one of us. And I release this word that I have spoken, my witness, to the law of cause and effect, which has already started to move it into form so that everybody can see it, so that we can demonstrate, show that this stuff works and that the light is still fully present. I allow this all to be, and together we affirm, and so it is.